Hello, listeners. Welcome to The Array. This is a new podcast that's about games and what I think about when it comes to games. Whether or not they're art, whether or not they're just games, whether or not they mean anything, or is there something deeper going on behind the scenes? That's what this podcast is for me. And who am I, you might ask? That's simple. My name is Jared. It's nice to meet you. And I hope you enjoy listening to what I would consider as basically being a series of regurgitation of ideas when it comes to the sphere of video games. I love them. I hope you guys love them. And I can't wait to see what they become in the future. It is absolutely the most exciting time to be, just to be, when it comes to video games. There's so much coming out. There's so much interesting mechanics, narrative stories, designs that are coming from this industry. It's nuts. I love it so much. And that's why I wanted to have a podcast for it, so that I could sit down and talk about what I like, what I don't like, how it correlates to me in my life, and hopefully that'll be entertaining for you. Without further ado, this is the pilot episode, episode 0 of The Array. Okay, so introductions. What is this actually even about? Trying to talk about video games, the medium itself, and how it's evolved over time to the point where we're seeing that video games are more than just games in that competitive sense. They've turned into something a little bit more. And one like myself would make the argument that it's actually kind of transcended into art. And that's where this podcast comes into play. So the goal of me having these little mini sessions of communicating my thoughts and kind of regurgitating those meditations into an audio format for you is really to kind of get the opinion out there. And to see what other people think about this idea of games becoming essentially the de facto medium. What in a video game would not allow for the truest expression of someone's art? You can literally create whatever you want, and it combines all the different types of mediums within it. And what I mean by that is that it's more than just competition. It's more than just, can I win? Now we've introduced narratives. We've introduced these sweeping soundtracks. We've introduced all of these different elements that take video games into a new direction. And it's not like it's been happening in the past, 5 years. We've seen this type of evolution occur probably since about the 80s, whenever we saw the introduction of the RPG element into video games. And I'm not a video game historian, really, by any means, so, fact check me all you want. I'm probably wrong. And that's okay. I'm fine with being wrong. But I have been involved in this industry and this medium and this form of entertainment since I was a very small boy. I was probably like 4 years old when I played my first video game. And I think, believe it or not, it was Mortal Kombat on a Sega Genesis. Way to go, parenting, right? That's the first introduction to video games, and it's the goriest, bloodiest game imaginable at the time. Oh, how much more gory and violent video games have become since that '90s Sega Genesis. Well, not the Sega Genesis necessarily, but Mortal Kombat on the Sega Genesis. But it's kind of this interesting thing where we see that kind of evolution, and that evolution itself is really kind of fascinating to me, which is the primary reason why I wanted to start up a podcast. And so this is going to be considered like that episode 0. This is kind of the pilot concept idea. And I wanted to give a little bit of background on myself. I've been playing video games for a really long time, and I've seen them evolve into being something that's a little bit more than just, here's an objective, can you win or do you lose? Which is kind of like the lowest form of how you would describe a video game. And it's really interesting to see how we've introduced all these various elements, and now we have something that is way more, God, I don't even know. It's hard to express it because it is so encompassing. It's almost like an amalgamation of various forms of art that produce a singular thing. And it's kind of hard to explain in words. I do think that at some point in time, we're probably going to see video games becoming art pieces. We'll have little sections inside of an art installment, by some publisher somewhere that's just going to decide, we need to have, our top selling games represented in this installation, but then it's going to evolve from that, and it's going to be, the top selling games that were also like impactful and meaningful narratively or even artistically. And, one of the games that like really comes to mind for me in that context was I think it's the 2018 God of War. I think it was 2018. Maybe it's 2019, and I'm just getting my years mixed up. But yeah, like that game to me was more than just, are you going to win or are you going to lose? It transcended something with me, and I think it's because like right around that same time where this game comes out, I'm learning how to be a dad. And I wouldn't say I was Kratos levels of irritable, but my younger self, I definitely had a temper. I was way more aggressive than I am now that I'm in my I'm almost 30. I'm 29. I'll be 30 here in a couple of months, and now that I've like kind of reached that point in my life, I've realized I was pretty intempered in my youth. I was not always the nicest person to be around. And I could get to the point where I felt like there was just one answer for everything, and I viewed the world very black and white. And I think that's where you define the maturity in an individual. Do they see everything as black and white, or do they notice the shades of gray? And those shades of gray being, all sorts of different levels of nuance. And I didn't really get that until I guess maybe a little bit later in life, but I could attribute that to my upbringing if I want to get deeply psychological about it, which I don't. So don't even ask that. But yeah, I just wanted to take a moment, and this is really just kind of an introductory statement to kind of talk about my experience with video games. And I want to try and produce an episode pretty regularly. I don't know if I'd be able to do it once a week. That would be awesome if I could, but bi-weekly seems pretty doable because in addition to this, I'm a full-time web developer. So I I can occasionally work insane hours, and then other times I have nothing to do. So here we go, podcast. Which is actually funny enough. I'm starting in the middle of like really ramping up on clients, and then I'm like, hey, I'll do a podcast. So we'll see how everything pans out. But I think this is just a good opportunity for me to kind of like get my voice out there, see what people think, see if there's any like feedback. Because maybe I'm just crazy. Maybe video games will not become this like all-encompassing de facto medium that I think it will be. I'm kind of like future casting a little bit that I think it's going to get to that point. And I think it will be, it's going to likely not come from like the big publishers. I mean, I know I just referenced God of War, which does come from a big publisher. Sony is huge. But I mean, at the time of this recording, one of the most popular games is Among Us. I would say it doesn't fall into that category of like art that I was, portraying before, but it is kind of amazing that game is so popular right now. And I can't imagine the budget dollars for that game being more than like, God, I don't know, maybe like 50K, 60K, maybe. I mean, if that. Like, it's just kind of crazy that, like, at least within video games, and maybe it's more of a reflection of the gamer community, but it's like these smaller games can just totally eclipse these huge productions in terms of value. And maybe that's really what it's a representation of. It's just, maybe more people can afford this game, and, that's where they're defining the value from. But I also know there's like this huge social element to that game. So that game gaining popularity in the middle of us dealing with a pandemic kind of makes sense. You have this social chat option where you're just talking to random people you don't really know, and you're like trying to determine whether or not they're going to kill you in the game, really. And trying to understand these people is literally a matter of life and death for your character, which maybe that's why it's like so engrossing for people right now, is it's giving them a little bit of that like public interaction. And it's kind of funny because while I'm recording this, I'm literally watching my waveform, and I can tell I'm getting more excited the more I talk about this game and why it's working so well. I feel like there's something wrong with me. But I just, it's kind of amazing to me that I think that games could go in this direction. And I really want to see what the future is going to be like with games that are going to have some of these bigger budgets, or maybe, have a dedicated narrative director or actual writer that's going to try to create these engrossing stories. Because I know like the dev cycle for God of War, which I mentioned before, like the dev cycle for that game is crazy. It was so crazy. They basically like worked for like a year or so on creating a demoed it in front of E3 in like 2017 or 2016, something like that. And then the next year cranked the game out. And it's somehow one of the most resonating games I've played, I would say, in my more adult life. Like there are very few games that have gotten anywhere near how impactful that game was. And maybe it was just a matter of timing. Like I said before, I was becoming a dad. I was learning the ropes. I was learning how to control my temper around my son, because he would do things, and they're things that shouldn't be done, and that there's a right and a wrong when it comes to raising a child. So when something wrong happens, you have to handle it, but you have to handle it with grace, and it's a very difficult thing to do, especially when you're me. And I'm probably on the spectrum for being a little bit autistic, and I know that my son is. So it's entirely possible that there's some sort of correlation there. But it's interesting because I have a very clear, this is the right way of doing things, this is the wrong way of doing things. And it wasn't until a little bit later into my son being around that I had this like realization of like there is nuance, and that nuance needs to be observed, and it needs to be leveraged, implemented. You got to do more than just know that it's there. You got to actually incorporate it in how you address things. So like with my son, for example, it was learning how to approach the wrong thing that he's done with an element of, he probably doesn't know that this is wrong, or he knows that this is wrong, but he doesn't understand the consequence of the wrongdoing and how to navigate that situation. Because honestly, that's a pretty reoccurring theme within that game. And it's kind of interesting. Like I also have my notes pulled up here, and I have nothing about God of War. I have nothing at all about God of War in my notes. And here I am going on about this game. That should tell you like just how impactful it is. Like it's literally gotten into the core of my being. And it makes me wonder, like, what other games are out there that do that for people, where they play these games and there's something about the story, there's something about the narrative, there's something about a character that makes them introspective, makes them think about who they are and how they act. And that, I think, is a very interesting thing, because you get that from movies occasionally. I know you can get it from books. I know a lot of people get that from books. And I know plenty of people that get it from movies. You know, they see some type of protagonist character interact with something that is something they've either been around or been exposed to, and they see the way that that character reacts to that situation. And then from there, make the decision, I maybe want to emulate that character a little bit more. You know, I want to be a little bit more like that, because that to me seemed to be like the right way of handling things. You know, that was a example, or a simulation, if you will, of how to do the right thing. And I'm not going to try and make the argument that games are going to teach people how to do the right thing, because then that opens up the argument for games could teach you how to do the wrong thing, which is really the backbone of, I would say, a lot of the Christian conservative argument about how games are introducing more violence within our society. And that, you know, that's something that's deeply political, and I probably shouldn't even have brought it up, because once the politics wheels start going, it's really hard to turn them off, especially when you're, past your 25-year-old age, where you're like, okay, I got to start being an adult. But it is kind of an interesting thing that it seems almost possible that we could be learning something from video games and from movies. And I guess really it boils down to, we're learning something from a story. You know, we're learning something from an example of how a character, antagonist or protagonist, interacts with a situation. And it's almost like, from both angles, it's a representation of, how can you do the right or wrong thing. And it gets really dicey, because, we live in this age of, like, everything is morally relative. Your right doesn't necessarily equal to my right, and your wrong doesn't equal to my wrong. And while I do think that there is a middle ground somewhere in there, for the most part, there are things that are definitively right and definitively wrong. There are things that can be objectively, or maybe not objectively, but can at least be agreed upon, that here's a good thing, here's a bad thing. And that's kind of like that discussion of like good and bad is kind of what led me into really what the meat of this episode is supposed to be about, at least according to my notes. I went a little bit off track. I imagine that's going to happen a lot, so hopefully you don't mind. If you do, this is probably not for you. I hate to say it, but that's probably true. You're probably going to hate this if you're just like, oh my God, he rambles so much. I can't take it. Cause yeah, I'm a rambler. I toss out ideas. My brain is going a mile a minute, and my mouth cannot keep up with the ideas that my brain is just like throwing out there. It's very difficult. It's hard to exist right now, especially right now, where you don't have that like buffer of the outside world telling you like, that's stupid. That's a bad idea. Don't do that. So now like everything is a good idea right now. And I'm trying to like get that buffer from any means necessary. And maybe that's what this is. This podcast is really just a plea for help. That's really what it is. I'm just kidding. Well, maybe not. I don't know. We'll see. But the real meat of this podcast was to talk about something that I thought was particularly interesting. If you're like at all involved with the gaming community, you've probably heard of a game coming out. I think it's actually in 30 days, called Cyberpunk 2077, and it's a first-person dystopian cyberpunk RPG. God, that's a long list of adjectives to describe this thing. That's based off of a tabletop RPG game, and it's produced by, in my opinion, so keep in mind that's going to be a funneling bias through this entire thing, but it's produced by a company that I think is probably one of the best game development companies that has ever existed, and that's CD Projekt Red. They're most known at this point in time for the Witcher series, which there's not a lot of them. There's only 3 Witcher games, and the level of, I guess you would say, like, what's a good word for this? Like, just the level of production between those installations of The Witcher are mind-boggling. You play the first one and you're like, that was interesting. You know, it's an interesting kind of story, but, you know, the gameplay is a little janky. I'm just going to be straight with you there. It's pretty janky. But then you have the second one. It's still a little bit janky, but the graphics are just on point. Like, that second game, at the time it came out, was just amazing. Like, I don't think I've seen a game up to that point that looked that good with the hardware we had back then. Like, that was intense. And there are still, like, design elements from that game that I wish were in Witcher 3. And then we get into Witcher 3, which is this sprawling, semi-open world game that, you know, just has so much to do. So much to do. And, you know, so, like, just the levels of production, you can tell, like, this is a game development company and publisher. They self-publish, as far as I know. But, you know, they're a company that's consistently produced something good for its time. They've consistently made something that most people that play the game can consider good. And what we're dealing with right now is, I think it was about 5 days ago, there was an article released on the Forbes magazine, by the way. Maybe not the magazine, but like it's on the Forbes website, that talked about how we need to stop defending this development company, CD Projekt Red, because they instituted a crunch, a dev crunch. And what that crunch was you were going to work mandatory an extra day in a week up until the game launches. And at first I was kind of like, this is a weird thing to write an article about. Because, I mean, crunches are nothing abnormal within the game development cycle, the game production cycle. Having a crunch is almost expected as you're leading up to a launch. And generally the crunches, you know, they fix a lot of different things. And generally they're trying to target bugs at that point. And usually it's like game-breaking bugs. Like, these are bugs where, like, something saves wrong, and then your entire save file is, like, corrupted, and you're done. You have to start over. So having some type of crunch is kind of expected. So doing a little bit of research, I found out that at some point in time, CD Projekt Red decided that they were not going to have a crunch leading up to the launch, which was a firm launch on November 19th. And the lead up to that really got fucked up because of COVID, and understandably fucked up because of COVID. Like, how are you supposed to maintain your development pipeline when none of your workers can be in the same building? Like, you can't maintain that and push something out at the same date you agreed it was going to come on. You know, like the same day that you were going to launch. That's pretty much impossible, because you would have to have some type of backup dev pipeline for this kind of event and predict it happening, which is virtually impossible. So out the gate, where this article is coming from doesn't really even make sense. And it's actually kind of a continuation of someone else's words. And I think the reason why I'm wanting to pick on this particular article by Forbes is because it's Forbes. You know, this isn't some like just random game journalist article. This is a somewhat reputable medium. This is a somewhat reputable company. You know, people cite Forbes whenever something good is happening with their company, and Forbes acknowledges it. You know, people want to have that like positive interaction with Forbes because of its recognition. And yet this article just gets published in what feels like there was no editorial oversight at all, which is the craziest part, because this article is really talking about how CD Projekt Red made a promise. They went back on that promise and instituted a mandatory crunch when they said they weren't going to have a crunch. Okay, you know, the world's ending. A developer didn't do what they said they were going to do in the middle of a pandemic. Okay. the world is over is really the direction that this article takes that, because it rapidly turns into, we need to not defend this company for forcing their employees to work an extra day. So, and to give you a little bit of background with CD Projekt Red, they're a Polish company. They're not American. So they have different labor laws. And that's something that gets brought up in the article itself to basically identify like any overtime is paid, salary or not. So they're already getting compensation. And with the CD Projekt Red employee benefits, profit sharing is actually part of it. So if you work on a project that is profitable, you will get more money as the profits of that product roll in. You know, really, like, believe it or not, that's like the truest example of like the capitalist mentality. That right there is a good example of trickle down economics. Like, we don't see that a lot, especially in the United States, where the argument for capitalism is so strong. But, you know, and really not necessarily the argument for capitalism, but the argument that trickle down economics works. And it can work if you do it like that. So profit sharing is a perfect example of how trickle down economics can work, as long as it's being done properly, which I think in this case CD Projekt Red is actually doing it pretty well. Their employees do not hate working there. You know, like their employees actually voted to have this mandatory crunch put on them. And that was something that was insinuated. I don't know if we could consider it confirmed, but there was a contact at Game Informer. In fact, there's a podcast for it, and maybe I will find those and put them in some type of description below. But there's a podcast for it where they talk about the fact that this employee for Game Informer has contacts within CD Projekt Red, and they even go on to say that, well, they asked for this crunch because they didn't want to delay it again. So here we have an individual writing an article on a magazine that has worldwide recognition, talking about how we need to stop defending a company who made an internal decision with their employees about how to handle a problem. I want you to let that sink in for a bit, because what that's really saying is, regardless of what the employees want, the company did something wrong to the employees, even though the employees got what they asked for. What that is doing is basically creating a no-win scenario to try and make it seem like your employers, because consider pretty much any conversation like this, any conversation like this is really designed to try and tell you to look at this situation from your frame of mind. Try to understand how your power is being taken away from you, instead of recognizing the fact that when you are a part of a company like CD Projekt Red, where they have offered you the choice, you have a choice. We can either delay this and push it back even further, or we can work harder to release it at the time we specified we would, after we've already pushed it back. So we have this decision from the employees that says, let's do the crunch. You know what? Let's, fuck it. Let's do the crunch. Let's not push it back again. Let's try to save that public relationship with the individuals, the massive amount of individuals we've told we're going to release on November 19th. Let's actually hold our word to that, because that, to us as a company who develops an entertainment product, is more important than the fact that we'll have to work an extra day a week. So they make that decision. And then you have this article that's then trying to say, we need to be defending these people. Why? Why are we needing to defend these people? Why do we need to stop defending CD Projekt Red for saying that they weren't going to have a crunch and now they are? What about their tactics in this scenario were actually abusive? Because as far as I can tell, the employees asked for this. And what I think is so frustrating about this situation, and I know this is a pretty huge deviation from where we were at the beginning of this podcast, where I'm talking about how video games are art and blah, 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 and I'm getting all mushy. But the reason I'm so upset about it is because this, to me, marks an awareness. It marks an awakening for myself to see that this idea of someone trying to get ahead of a story has produced so much negativity and so much like really just slander about a company because he had ideas and didn't verify them. Ran with the story under a recognized brand. And I do want to be clear here. I'm not saying this guy should be canceled. Not all of his articles were bad, believe it or not. This one sucks, and I'm pissed off that he wrote it because some of his other stuff is not so bad. And, he has the title of senior contributor, and I'm not going to name him because, I can link to the article alone. You can get his name there. But, I'm pointing out the article. I'm not going to just shit on the individual, mostly because that's not necessarily fair to him. His worst mistake, quote unquote, which is kind of what I would identify this as, is not a representation of his body of work. We need to get out of that whole cancel culture bullshit, and this is a good example of it. He didn't do his due diligence in being a journalist. And, maybe that's the reason why he doesn't have the title journalist. Maybe this has been something that's happened in the past before. So he's just considered a contributor. And, consider that title whatever you want. My biggest issue is that even if he had produced this article to an editorial staff, it would not take, maybe not even a staff, just an editor in general, it would not take much to realize that there are already conflicting elements within the article. He cites the Game Informer podcast itself, where it goes on to talk about how the employees asked for this. And then he goes on to say, how CD Projekt Red, and keep in mind, I'm summarizing. Read the article for yourself. I always encourage, get to the true source, even if someone is being as completely unbiased as possible, which I know is impossible for me right now, because I've really loved the CD Projekt Red company. I loved what they've done, and I love that their employment and operation structure is the way that it is, because I do feel like that's probably the most fair way to do this, to produce a game, and they do it well. Because as far as I can tell, all their games have basically been good. I haven't seen a bad game from CD Projekt Red. And if there is a bad game from CD Projekt Red, I imagine it's one of their first. Because that's usually what happens. Your first game as a game design company it's shit. You should just expect it to be shit because you don't know anything. And, you don't know anything, quotations there. You don't know anything within the respect of other big corporations that are producing games. If we have an indie developer trying to go up against EA, yeah, they can make something that probably resonates better, but it won't have the same, technical perfection. And it's kind of funny to say considering EA games are usually shit. But it is just kind of to talk about the fact that there is usually a lack in understanding and generally a lack in depth of a particular technical aspect whenever you're in the independent sphere. And that should just be expected. But just to go back a little bit on what I was saying about bias and this cancel culture thing, I don't think this guy should never be able to publish a Forbes article again. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like the likelihood of that happening is probably pretty high. I feel like people have disagreed with this article so much that if there is an editor or some sort of editorial staff that he answers to, they're probably going to come back and they may actually just tell him you can't write for us anymore. And which I think would be unfortunate if that is actually what happens, because his article, this one article, is not a representation of his body of work, and he has written good articles. You can find pretty much all the stuff that he's written on the Forbes site as a contributor, and I think he's got some stuff in some other places as well. And those articles are good. They're good reads. And this one I feel like is just, I don't know. I don't know if maybe it's just because he was just coming at it from a bad direction. I don't know if maybe it was just that, he's kind of heated up about how he feels his current career path is going, and there's a frustration there. Maybe that's what this is really stemming from. And, I can't really speak to that, but I just find it so strange, so just peculiar that he's gone this direction with CD Projekt Red when really CD Projekt Red was doing exactly what, quote unquote, woke people would expect a company to do. And it's just this weird dynamic where it feels like in no way can you actually win. So if that's the scenario, why would people even try to appease you? You know, like, why would people even try to do what you ask? You just expect them to do the quote unquote morally right thing because it's morally right. Well, if you chastise them for doing the right thing, the logical step is to assume that you've done the wrong thing because you're being chastised. Kind of like raising a kid. If my son does something right and I chastise him for that right thing, and then he does the wrong thing and I chastise him for the wrong thing, what is my son left to think? Other than do nothing and ignore my direction, because it doesn't make sense. And that's kind of where we land with this whole Forbes magazine article. I keep saying magazine. It's because, like, okay, I grew up in the 90s, all right? We had pamphlets and papers and shit that came from these companies. So Forbes is always a magazine to me, and I can't get away from it. Even though this did not come out in the Forbes magazine, it came out on the website, just for clarity. But it's just like, it's such an interesting and almost frustrating situation because CD Projekt Red did the right thing from my perspective. And honestly speaking, I would still consider CD Projekt Red issuing a mandatory overtime without any type of employee choice. I would still consider that the right thing to do from the company perspective, because they've already delayed the game. They already delayed the game. Delaying it further is going to be a bigger hit than the employees having to work an extra day per week for the next 2 months. And it may not even be, it's not even the next 2 months. It's like 1 month and a week. So 5 weeks of mandatory work, or 6 weeks of mandatory work. Like, that's nothing. And the reason why I can say that's nothing is because I worked as a contractor. I am a freelance web developer. When it's crunch time and I got to get something out the door and in the eyes of a client, there are days where I have literally worked like 10 hours Saturday and Sunday to get something done right, because the accuracy mattered more than the fact that my client needed something on a particular day. So instead of going back to my client and saying, yeah, it's not going to be fixed, it's not going to be done, I take the time to do it right. And I think that's really where we're seeing just this mindset that almost doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense for employees to treat working for an employer like it's some sort of, democracy-like relationship, because it's really not that, unless the business allows you to have that. Like, yeah, you have individual rights as a person. You don't have to work for that company. You can go work somewhere else if you want to. That's the freedom of having a skill or a trade. You don't have to work where you don't want to. And I don't want to get like too deep into the sociology of this, but I feel like that's a situation that we're seeing happening a little bit more and more, is that people are employees, but they work a job that they don't like, or they work a job where they're not finding fulfillment because it's not a trade that they're interested in. And I wouldn't necessarily consider being in a call center a trade, but it is a skill set. Not everyone can thrive in a call center environment. I know I can't. I get irritable. I get real angry, and I've done it. I've been in a call center before. I've worked that kind of job. I know what it's like. So, 100% respect to people that do that, and that is their job, and they don't absolutely hate it. If you absolutely hate it, you go do something else. And if you have a skill, you can absolutely apply that in some other way or fashion. I think what really happens is that there's this push for security that just cripples people. Like, I understand you want to feel secure in, like your employment, you're getting your money, you're getting the benefits, you're getting, some semblance of kind of regardless of what happens, I should be okay. And the truth is, you're not going to be. Like, you're still at the whim of your client, which is also your employer. Like, you need to be thinking of how you're interacting with your job as I am the professional, they are my client, and I am doing a job for them. I am doing something that they need, and they are paying me money for that need. If you don't maintain that mindset, I feel like you're doomed for failure, because you're always going to be upset. You're always going to be irritated that you're not getting what you think you deserve. And really what it came down for me, is that I was so tired of not feeling like I wasn't getting what I was worth. And it's because I knew I was worth more. And I knew I was worth more because I had a skill set and I had a trade, and I knew it pretty well. I could execute it pretty well. So instead of just complaining about that all the time and collecting that paycheck, I made a decision. I made a decision which ultimately landed me in hot water with the employer, and they fired me over it. And I'm sitting here smiling because it's like, at that point, it's like I just didn't care. I was so tired of working for them that it didn't matter to me that they fired me. And honestly, within 3 weeks, and I know this is anecdotal, so, take it with a grain of salt, but, within 3 weeks, I had my own independent client, and I was working on building up a career that I'm pretty happy with now. And so I want to encourage people to try and think about things from that angle, because I honestly believe you'll find it to be a happier way of living, because you're kind of aggregating more freedom for yourself. You're pulling in something that you're building up, and it's going to get you to the point where you do have that freedom to pursue things. Like anybody could, do this, like do a podcast. All it takes is some recording software and a mic, and you can do it. But I think a lot of people are probably a little bit too scared to do it because, it takes time, and that time could be applied to something else that maybe could just make them money. And, that turns into another argument of, try to maintain that balance in your life, because really that balance in your life is going to make all the effort that you put into becoming your own worth it. Now, the reason I have this little mini rant about employers and why you should think of yourself in a certain way in respect to your employer is because this Forbes article, I didn't say magazine, this Forbes article basically represents a mindset. And that mindset is that the people who employ you just lord over you. And that's only accurate if you're the one just getting pissed in the face. If you're just standing there getting pissed on, you have no one to blame but yourself. So stop getting pissed on. Go live a life. Go find something that makes you genuinely happy. Pursue it with every fiber of your being. Embrace the uncertainty and insecurity. And I guarantee you, as long as you've put in that real effort, you will find something that makes you happy. You will find something that brings you peace, and you will not get pissed off, and you will not feel the need to defend people who don't need defending because of a crunch, because you've got to work more now. You'll get to a point where you actually appreciate the fact you have to work more, because it's about more than just, I got some money. Now it's about, I'm building something up. I'm building up a reputation. I'm making something that's fucking awesome, like Cyberpunk 2077. Thank you guys so much for listening to our pilot episode for a new game-oriented podcast called The Array. I hope you enjoyed listening to this pilot. I hope that you would like to hear more of this kind of content, and I hope that it's something that encourages engagement, encourages you to be interested in games, maybe from a different perspective. That's really what we're going for in general. That's what I want for this podcast. I want you to see video games in a different way than just, did you win or did you lose? There is a shade of gray here, and we should talk about it. If you would like to hear more, head over to Studio Stargazer, the Mindwave Network, and we have podcasts for virtually any topic that you would want to listen to or discuss. We have multiple different locations where you can listen to all sorts of different podcasts, and I would probably include those in the description below, because off the top of my head, I don't know URLs. Who the fuck does that? No one. That's who. Always check descriptions when you can. Love you.